In this video, I will be disseminating the findings of my honours research project, and my project provided an account of the psychological impacts of COVID-19 on New Zealand youth, and also looked at their resiliency. Before I get started, I really wanted to firstly express my gratitude to the youth who participated in my project. Your guys' involvement in this research project was truly invaluable, and the lived experiences you guys shared with me about your pandemic experiences really did help inform the research project and shaped it, and it also really just highlighted youth's agency and capacities in disasters. I also really quickly wanted to just introduce myself, so I just finished my honours year in psychology at the University of Auckland. I'm also an interdisciplinary academic, so I draw on community psychology and also human geography. And as a disaster researcher, I'm particularly interested in youth in disasters, so understanding their vulnerabilities and also involving them in disaster risk reduction, just because I truly do believe that youth are not these weak and passive victims of disasters, but they're capable and knowledgeable individuals who can actively protect themselves. So this is the kind of stuff I explore in my research. So to jump into things, I want to provide you guys with some background information first. So my research project was interdisciplinary in nature. It drew on community psychology and human geography, and investigated COVID-19 as a unique multi-system level disaster event. So my project had two primary research questions. So the first question sought to understand New Zealand youth's experiences of how COVID has impacted their psychological health and well-being during this pandemic. And the second question sought to understand how New Zealand youth have maintained their psychological health and well-being throughout the pandemic as it continues as this ongoing disaster event. So in the study, youth was defined as those between the ages of 16 and 24, and this is just in line with the UN's definition of youth in the context of disasters. So my research project had three research objectives. So the first objective was to identify how different aspects of the current pandemic impacted youth psychological health and well-being. And the second objective was to identify the impacts COVID had on New Zealand youth psychological health and well-being. And this was accounted for in regard to Jury's Te Whare Tapawha conceptualization of Maori health and well-being. So youth's physical, mental, spiritual, and relational health and well-being was accounted for. And then the third objective was to identify the capacities of New Zealand youth that have helped them to maintain all four aspects of their health and well-being during this pandemic. So really quickly to outline the methodology, the research project took a mixed methods approach, and it did use an online semi-structured questionnaire. So it was created by myself and it had a mixture of multiple choice question, matrix tables of Likert scales, and short answer questions. And these questions just all related back to those research objectives. And then data collection occurred over a 3-month period, and it did coincide with the early period of the August lockdown that New Zealand was in as entire country for a brief period of time, and then which Auckland lasted in for about 100 days, so 3 months almost, a bit over 3 months. So 75 responses were collected, and the 50 responses were included in that final analysis, just following data filtering. And then of the participants that were included in the study, a majority were female, that's at 81.7%, and 17.1% were male, and 1.2% were non-binary or gender diverse. And we also had a wide range of ethnic identities among our participants. In terms of location, a majority of them were from Auckland, and one each was from Dunedin, Rotorua, and Hamilton. So the findings of the study would be more representative of the unique pandemic experiences of Auckland youth. But this may be beneficial because compared to youth from outside of Auckland, youth in Auckland did experience several lockdowns over the 2-year period following the beginning of the pandemic, and they did endure the most intense and that prolonged lockdown in New Zealand. And then so for data analysis, both quantitative and qualitative analysis was carried out, and this was just in accordance with the mixed method approach taken in the study. So for quantitative data, responses were counted for each question, and data entry was done just in Excel, and that's just to organize statistical data for analysis. And then the data from there was just tabulated, graphed, and analysed, and that was just percentage responses and probabilities were calculated. And this is just done to quantify and summarize particular aspects of youth's pandemic experiences. Then in terms of qualitative data, reflexive thematic analysis was conducted, and it involved Braun and Clark's six-step process, which involves data formalization, data coding, and then the combining of initial codes. And then general themes are generated, and then they are reviewed and altered, creating a list of final themes. Then detailed analysis is carried out, and they're reported through analytic writing. So just some more information around that thematic analysis process. So these were a couple of initial codes that were generated as I went over the open-ended open-ended responses from the questionnaire. So codes like around anxieties and worries, around the vaccination, government messaging, seeking COVID-19 information, all those aspects of well-being and how youth coped with pandemic stresses and what tools they used. And then once these initial codes were created, they were reviewed, and they were combined to generate initial themes, and this is just according to similar patterns of meaning which was present in the responses. And then these were some of the themes that were generated. So once again, around anxiety, around changes in alert levels and community transmission, essential worker concerns, self-isolation, close contact anxiety, once again, vaccination, government information, information seeking, and then the well-being aspects. And then these themes just reviewed again, and they were refined. They were refined in reference to Marston and Moiti Stefani's theoretical understanding of pandemic as a multi-system disaster. So this understanding is based on the understanding of pandemics, which historically tended to impact several systems in society at one time, so different areas like education, social life, employment, economy, and so on. Themes are also reviewed and refined in reference to Marston's conceptualization of resilience as a systems concept. So this conceptualization allowed resilience to be understood as an ongoing process. So it allowed for the portrayal. So this ongoing process portrays the ability of individuals as they successfully adapt to challenges that arise from adversities that threaten their survival, the daily functioning, and also their development as a disaster unfolds. So by the end of the analysis, 4 themes were apparent, and each had numerous sub-themes. So the first theme was around anxiety experiences during community transmission and lockdowns, and 4 sub-themes related to anxiety, so feelings of uncertainty, academic worries, social isolation, and fear of self or loved one being infected. And the second theme is around employment experiences, essential work, and close contact experiences. This one had 2 sub-themes, so once again, concern of self or family contracting COVID, and then the second was around experiences of anxiety, loneliness, and boredom. And then the third theme was around vaccination, government messaging, and information seeking. This one had 6 sub-themes, so around the vaccination, the first lead office safety, the second one was around reservations youth had around vaccine effectiveness and side effects. The third sub-theme was around government messaging and how for youth it brought them comfort and also encouragement in terms of being involved in the national team effort of eliminating COVID. And then also sub-theme 4 was around some youth found that they were more forced and fake kind of government messaging. And then the 5th sub-theme is around regular information seeking. The 6th one was around the avoidance of COVID-19 information. And then theme 4 was around psychological impacts and youth's everyday capacities. And the 4 sub-themes related back to those 4 aspects of well-being, how they were impacted, and then how youth also maintain those aspects of well-being. So this first section of my findings, it answers and speaks to the first research question, and that was which sought to understand New Zealand youth's experiences of how COVID had impacted their health and well-being during the pandemic. So what was found was that youth in the study experienced multiple stresses, and these arose from pandemic changes that occurred to different systems in society, and that together just accumulated to impact youth psychological health and well-being. So youth shared experiences of stresses and changes that they shared experience of stresses that arose from changes to their educational experience, which caused them quite a lot of academic worries around getting good grades, missing out on school activity. Their social lives were disrupted as well and changed. They experienced feelings of social deprivation because of the lockdown restrictions and the physical distancing rules we had, because they were unable to see family and friends because of that. And then youth who were essential workers also experienced changes to how they worked and they expressed concerns around their safety and also that of their families related to them or their family related to them catching COVID, coming home and then spreading the virus to their family. And then youth also experience financial changes caused by either losing their job or having reduction in hours, and it caused them quite a lot of economic stress. This is particularly around them or their family meeting basic living cost. And then it was also found that youth in the study experienced stress due to fear of self or their loved one being infected with COVID-19 in the public. So things like going grocery shopping or going to the doctors. And then they also had some kind of stress and anxiety around because of vaccination concerns. So once again, around that vaccine effectiveness and also side effects of the vaccine, which was quite unknown. And this made 13% of youth quite vaccine hesitant. And then also COVID-19 information overload, which made youth feel quite overwhelmed and panicked. And then these findings all together confirm predictions made in the literature, especially around predicted challenges arising for youth from adapting to online learning, working as essential worker, adjusting to life during community transmission, and also restrictive lockdown conditions, self-quarantine economic challenges as well. And together these findings highlight that youth in New Zealand dealt with multiple co-occurring stresses which arose from multiple systems in society because of these changes that occurred during the pandemic, and they all impacted youth psychological health and well-being at once. So because youth dealt with an accumulation of several adverse experiences, which were these multiple pandemic stresses, it resulted in heightened levels of anxiety for youth during periods of community transmission. So it was found in the study that during periods of community transmission, when the lockdown was imminent, 86% of youth experienced some level of anxiety, but 62% of youth stating that the anxiety they felt was at moderate to high levels. And this finding of youth's heightened anxiety is consistent with findings of increased anxiety levels among Chinese, Canadian, German, and Swiss youth as well during the pandemic. And this suggests that heightened levels of anxiety are a common chronic response youth around the world are currently experiencing during this pandemic. And this is quite concerning as prolonged experiences of anxiety can then in the long term impact youth psychological health and well-being, and also their daily functioning, which can then go on to impact things like their education, the interpersonal relationships that can then alter and change their life outcomes. And this finding of youth's experience of heightened anxiety caused by exposure to a large number of adversities also suggests a possible dose-response effect. And the occurrence of this effect portrays just how detrimental disasters can be to youth psychological health and well-being. And it also emphasizes the need for disaster preparedness initiatives, so especially those that help enhance youth's capacities to cope with multiple disaster stresses. So kind of initiatives that help youth learn skills around to better cope emotionally with stresses would be quite good as well. So in terms of their mental health and well-being, it was found in a study that during community transmission, unexpected community transmission, 52% of youth identified that their mental health was either much worse or worse than usual. And this emphasizes youth's experiences of relatively poor mental health and well-being during times of community transmission. And this finding here is consistent with Hawke et al.'s findings of Canadian youth's perceived reduction in mental health across the first 3 weeks of the pandemic when it was compared to findings from 3 weeks before the pandemic began in Canada. And in line with this finding of poor mental health, in our study, 1/3 of youth it was found that they struggled to maintain their mental health and well-being during periods of lockdown. And this is a concerning finding, especially given that the state of New Zealand's mental health has been worsening over time, that we have one of the highest suicide rates globally, because we know that youth who struggle to maintain their mental health are genuinely at risk of developing those long-term mental health issues. And together, these findings altogether of poor mental health highlight the important need for adequate and accessible support for youth who do struggle with their mental health. This will help in preventing suicide and also the development of those mental health issues that can define youth as they grow up and carry on with their lives. And this finding also provides support for that movement currently occurring in New Zealand, which is fighting for a better mental health system, as the system is overburdened and broken with those long wait lists. On the other hand, it was found that during lockdown, 67% of youth in the study identified that their mental health was either just okay or relatively good. And this is an encouraging finding and portrays youth resiliency, which I will talk to shortly. In terms of physical, relational, and spiritual health and well-being, the majority of youth in the study experienced good levels of these different aspects of well-being. And this is a reflection of youth's ability to adapt to pandemic changes that threaten their daily functioning and these physical, spiritual, and relational well-being. And I'll talk about how youth maintain these aspects of well-being shortly as well. And before that, it was also found that a smaller portion of youth in the study experienced poor levels of physical, family, and relationship and spiritual health and well-being. And this finding is concerning for youth who would have experienced poor well-being across multiple aspects of well-being, as they would have experienced multiple and more intense emotional, physical, and disassociative responses as well, which have just come together to impact their daily functioning and everyday lives. This finding is also especially concerning for our Indigenous and minority youth who have additional vulnerabilities associated with things like racism, neglect, poverty, homelessness, and also accessing adequate healthcare, which together increases their risk of developing mental health issues compared to their Pākehā counterparts in New Zealand during this pandemic. As they would have had to deal with multiple pandemic stresses amongst stresses associated with their marginalized identities. So these findings all further emphasize once again that critical need for adequate and accessible psychological support for youth in this country, especially because they lack access to it when they need it the most. And this is in the context of heightened stress and anxiety that they're going through right now in this pandemic. And they usually do tend to go through in disasters. And this provision of psychological support will definitely be immensely helpful for ensuring that youth successfully adapts to life as the pandemic continues to unfold over time. So this next section of my finding answers the second research question, which sought to understand how New Zealand youth have maintained their psychological health and well-being throughout the pandemic as this ongoing disaster event. So a key finding for this second research question was that youth actively and also creatively mitigated the negative effects of the lockdown and those related anxiety that came from those multiple pandemic stresses through drawing on their endogenous everyday capacities to maintain all aspects of their well-being, and this really did demonstrate their resiliency. So in terms of mental health and well-being, youth in the study shared that they practice mindfulness, took time to do something enjoyable and relaxing, and they discussed their mental health with their family or friends quite regularly. So they drew on those existing knowledge and skills related to emotion regulation and coping, but they also accessed available resources in their daily life to cope and to better regulate their emotions. And to deal with the impacts of those pandemic stresses and to maintain their mental health and well-being. Now, in terms of physical health and well-being, youth shared that they try to do things like get regular physical exercise, get a good night's rest, and eat a well-balanced, healthy diet during lockdowns. So they evidently also drew on existing knowledge and skills related to physical wellness practices, and they accessed resources available in their daily lives to creatively cope with pandemic changes to their lives and to maintain their physical health in creative ways. So, for example, you'd share that they use things like YouTube fitness videos because gyms are closed. So they use what resources they had at hand to maintain their physical well-being. And this portrays that capacities are not static, but frequently evolving and often in creative fashions. And this together just emphasizes the need for disaster preparedness initiatives that builds on youth's capacities. In terms of relational health and well-being, youth share that they called family and friends regularly. They use social media to connect to family and friends, and they did activities with those in their bubble. So youth, once again, they creatively try to overcome the social deprivation they were feeling brought by the pandemic restrictions, and they access things like technological resources and utilize everyday situations like cooking with their family and things like that to nurture their interpersonal relationships in this extraordinary, quite socially isolating context we've been in. And finally, in terms of spiritual health and well-being, you shared that they spent time in nature, they prayed to God or actively communicated with Him, and they learned about spirituality or philosophy around the meaning of life or what it means to be human. So you once again they practice their everyday spiritual activities, and they utilize relevant everyday resources, like books and things like that, to maintain their spiritual well-being in personally meaningful ways, despite disruptions brought to religious events and the closure of spiritual spaces. And also, they also spiritual coping techniques and tools to cope with the anxiety they were feeling from these multiple pandemic stresses. And then a second key finding for the second research question was that youth actively mitigated the negative effects of the lockdowns and all that anxiety through accessing external resources to maintain all aspects of their well-being, and once again further demonstrating their resiliency. So youth were seen to access three particular external resources. So the first external resource was the COVID-19 vaccination. And for 74% of youth in the study, helped them feel quite optimistic about the future. The vaccine eased anxiety around personal safety, and also enabled them to continue with their lives with a better sense of certainty as they felt safer, and they viewed the future as also more stable and certain place with the arrival and by taking the vaccination as well. And the second external resource was government messaging, such as Team of 5 million, be kind, be strong, we'll get through this. This is all just delivered through those daily COVID-19 press conferences, social media posts, and government advertisements. And this all brought comfort to 71% of youth in the study. And the messaging for them offered for them hope, eased their anxieties, and helped them to accept pandemic changes and gain control over their lives. And it made them feel like they had a role in New Zealand's COVID-19 elimination strategy as well. So they had that sense of control as well. And the final external resource was accessing COVID-19 information. And youth expressed that frequently accessing COVID-19 information, it enabled them to gain more awareness of the COVID-19 situation in their local community. And this helped them to predict and prepare for changes in alert levels and also their lives going forth in the future. So through seeking COVID-19 information, youth were also able to deal with that loss of control and uncertainty caused by the pandemic in their daily lives, as it just helped them to continue with their daily lives with a sense of stability and also routine, as they went on to accept the COVID-19 community transmission. As they stated, they regularly kept up to date with the situation in the community through more daily or frequent information seeking habits of theirs as the pandemic did progress. So these findings do have quite important implications. So first, in regards to how the government may seek to ensure mental health issues are prevented and well-being is promoted for youth as this pandemic does continue to unfold. So for example, it would be effective if the government reminded youth through a mental health promotion campaign of the everyday capacities and also those external resources youth can access to maintain their psychological health and well-being. And the involvement of youth in the decision making and creation process of such a campaign will be critical, as only youth can identify these things which will be important for them that they need access to. And the study's finding does offer some insight into what these things may be, like adequate and more accessible mental health support. In line with that, the provision of equitable and accessible mental support will be immensely beneficial for youth, especially those who are experiencing more severe and prolonged anxiety around pandemic stresses and also contracting COVID-19. This will be essential in preventing the development of long-term mental health issues, which develop when youth struggle to maintain their mental health on their own. This will be especially important given New Zealand that we have now moved away from our elimination strategy to living with COVID-19 in the community. And especially how some of these stresses youth in the study experience is likely to continue to affect them as community transmission is expected to continue. Another important implication of these findings is that they emphasize the need for disaster preparedness methods. And like I've said, those that more specifically focus on enhancing the capacity building skills of youth. And through these capacity building initiatives, youth will learn coping, emotion regulation skills, and also just strategies to enhance and strengthen the existing capacities so they can better learn to maintain their mental health and well-being during disaster events and to protect themselves from multiple disaster stresses. So some future directions. So firstly, future research should attempt to account for how the findings of the study have potentially shifted as this pandemic has continued. This is as there is a chance that youth psychological health and well-being may have worsened because of the extended period of lockdown Auckland has been in since August, and youth have endured being away from the things that are normal to them, like and for a very long time, so things like going to church or religious space quite regularly, seeing family and friends outside of Auckland or even overseas. This is all also important as in this study, mental health and well-being was found to be relatively poor with heightened levels of anxiety during community transmission and subsequent lockdowns. And currently, as we have shifted to living with COVID, there is a risk that mental health may have worsened, especially for those who do remain unvaccinated. And also, given the emergence of the highly mutant Omicron variant that is spreading globally and is more resistant to the vaccine, so it will be interesting to see what kind of fears or anxieties you have now. And Omicron is spreading at the moment, and it is putting countries back into restrictive settings and closing borders once again. So youth may still be unable to see people who are living overseas. And secondly, future research should also consider investigating the long-term psychological impacts of the pandemic on New Zealand youth. This will be given that the pandemic has been a life-changing event in youth's lives, and the occurrence of the dose-response effect in the study as well. And the effect is quite important as it causes an individual to experience increases in problem behaviors and also psychological distress because of that exposure there to several adverse experiences and adversities, which in the long term can then impact youth and as they grow up and go on with their lives and also their life outcomes. So a quick summary and a few take-home messages. So firstly, New Zealand youth dealt with multiple co-occurring stresses, and these arose from those pandemic changes across multiple systems in society, and they accumulated and altogether caused heightened levels of anxiety for youth. Because of this, it was found that New Zealand youth felt anxious for several reasons. So feelings of uncertainty around the future, academic worries, social deprivation, fear of themselves or a loved one contracting COVID, vaccine worries, and also COVID information overload. And for 1/3 of youth in the study, dealing with this was hard and quite challenging. Once again, emphasizing that need for adequate and accessible psychological support for New Zealand youth who are struggling. Most importantly, amid all these multiple co-occurring stresses that heightened youth's anxiety and did reduce their mental health and well-being, they did not do anything extraordinary, despite being in this quite extraordinary situation we have lived through over the past 2 years. Youth did maintain their health and well-being as the pandemic did unfold over time. They did demonstrate their resiliency through creatively drawing on their everyday endogenous capacities and accessing those external resources, which helped them to function in their daily lives a bit better and but a bit more confident and at ease as well. So youth in the study were capable individuals who resisted and coped with pandemic impacts on their psychological health and well-being, despite their heightened vulnerability in disasters. I guess altogether this proves that youth are not passive and weak victims of disaster events. They are capable actors with the ability to actively protect themselves in multi-system disaster events like pandemics. And this is an encouraging and very important finding for youth in the context of disasters. So that's pretty much what I've prepared. Thank you for watching, and once again, a big thank you to you who participated in the study. If you do have any questions, feel free to email me. My email will be in the description box below. Once again, thank you.